There are two from two different areas. One of them is behavioral science, which you can see on the left here. And behavioral science is very popular nowadays. Every conference you go to, there is a session. Most companies try to incorporate it. Countries have nudge units where they're trying to affect policy. And that's because behavioral science is relevant to everything we do in our everyday lives, because it describes how we make decisions in any aspect of our lives, whether that's financial behavior, health behavior, whatever it might be. And it describes the social, or rather the external or internal influences that shape our decisions. And externally, it might be the context that we find ourselves in, or the way that the choices are framed, or the social environment that affects the decision we might make. Internally, we have mental shortcuts, we have cognitive biases that we're using that also affect our decisions. And now these are all known as nudges, and we can use them to try and nudge behavior towards a certain direction. But these nudges are not specific to fundraising. Some of them might be relevant, and some of them might prove to be useful in increasing giving. But behavioral science is about how we make choices in general, aside from giving behavior. And that's why we bring in another area, which is the science of philanthropy, which focuses specifically on why people help each other. And that's in our social interactions, but also in the context of fundraising. And that's where we go beyond the nudge. That's when we use deep behavioral insights to explain behavior and try to influence it. And you can see listed here 3 concepts: identity, emotions, and impact, because these are 3 key drivers of helping behavior. So the following slides are going to share some case studies around these 3 key concepts and some testing that we've done around each of them. But at the end of the webinar, I will also share some testing we've done with 3 nudges. Right, so a bit of introduction on identity. You might have heard us talk about this before. Each one of us has many different identities, and each identity is associated with different motivations and goals, and that influences our behavior. Now, not all of our identities are activated at any given moment. Right now, our identity as fundraisers is activated, and that's why we joined the webinar. We're listening to this, we might be taking notes, and any other identity we might have right now is not relevant to this context. But I can easily prime them by mentioning, I don't know, something about my kids, and anyone who's parents, that identity comes to mind, and all the associated goals that come with that. So it's very easy to prime identities, to prime the goals that are associated with it, and change behavior. The reason we mention this here is because the concept that is important for charities is to find the supporter's identity, and that is their innate motivation that makes them support your cause. It's the part of who they are that makes them come to you. And if you discover that and you play that back, you can increase their engagement, their giving, or any other behavior that you want to influence. And that's what we try to do with a client, where after we finished an insights project and we discovered their supporters' identities, what we wanted to see is, could we increase the number of people who become members by playing the identity back at them? So we took a telemarketing script that they were using to ask for a membership sign up. And what we did is we included the identity question right up front in the conversation, so that we know if the supporter in this case is a bird enthusiast or a nature enthusiast. And what we did next was we played that back when we were asking for membership. And we did that by emphasizing the benefits they would get as members by visiting the reserves and being able to watch birds in one case, or nature in the other case. And when it comes to the cause, we emphasize the impact that it would have either on birds or nature. And just by doing that, we increased conversion by 15% and donor value by £10. And another example is with the Make-A-Wish Foundation, where we used Facebook and Facebook ads, where we had a control ad asking people to give money. And for our test, what we did is we explicitly called out medical professionals. And we did that just by adding a sentence: as a medical professional, you know the heartache of a child diagnosed with a critical illness. And then we continued with a control message: grant a wish. And because Facebook allows us to do that, we targeted medical professionals. And then we observed click-through behavior, and we found out that we had a 50% increase when we were playing back their identity. So hopefully that proves the value of discovering identities. And Lauren will now share what we've done around testing this with CRS.
Hi everyone, this is Lauren from Catholic Relief Services. So our first example is our Christmas renewal campaign. The most obvious identity for our donors is their Catholic identity. So in this mailing, we tried to play up our supporters' identity. This was our control package that's showing right now. So you might think talking about the Nativity and Christmas is enough of an identity check for our donors. But it doesn't quite make the connection between the supporters' faith and the cause. So then here is the test version. We emphasize how you could live out your faith by helping people in need. We did that right from the outer envelope, and we repeated the same message in the letter. And the test ended up raising 18.5% more in revenue over the control.
So that was an initial test, and as you can imagine, 95% of supporters of Catholic Relief Services is Catholic. So we wanted to dig a bit deeper into this identity concept, because we know how to talk to everyone now. We emphasize the need to live out their faith, but is there a way to discriminate supporters? Can we find an identity that will differentiate them? So we embarked on an insights project, and the identities we tested were two different expressions of the Catholic identity. One is around community, and it describes how we interact with other Catholics, or how, like going to church. And on the other side, we have a different kind of expression, which is Catholic conviction, and it describes how strictly you follow the Catholic teachings in your everyday life. In addition to these two, we tested an identity or the attitude, the degree to which people believed that the world is just, the fact that everyone gets what they deserve. And we also tested whether people feel a sense of responsibility towards people who are less fortunate. We also captured and tested their profession, which might be a relevant identity, or if they had any connection to any of the countries that CRS operates. We also tested whether a connection to poverty or adverse circumstances could explain their giving. And finally, we also captured this globalist identity, which describes a feeling of connectedness with everyone around the world. You feel that everyone is the same and everyone is connected. And from all these identities, we found that the globalist identity was the one that could differentiate supporters, in the sense that it could differentiate their value, commitment, and giving behavior to CRS. And this scale here is how you measure that globalist identity. And people who agree with these statements are, we call them high globalists, and we feel that we need to play that message back to them. So the next stage was, what is the best way to prime that identity? What is the best language to bring that front to mind? And there are many different ways that you can execute that. You can talk about helping neighbors in need, or you're being part of a family, helping your brothers and sisters. So there are many different messages that we wanted to test to find the best way to prime that identity. Lauren, would you like to explain how we did that?
So we wanted to test a variety of identity messages to see which ones our supporters prefer the most. For this purpose, we used DonorVoice's pretest tool to test thousands of different messages simultaneously. This multivariate testing allowed us to test over 11,000 packages in just 4 weeks. So here are the identities messages that we tested. The first one is our standard message, which already primes the globalist identity in very simple language. The second one introduces the concept of neighbors. The third refers to other people as being part of our family, while the fourth emphasizes their Catholic faith and the opportunity to express it. Finally, we also tested a message that explicitly says we should be helping people regardless of their faith. And then the scores will be shown, and they show the preference that the donors indicated. They range from 0 to 100. The higher the number, the more preferred the message is. They also signal magnitude, so a score of 80 is twice as preferred as a score of 40, for example. You can see the winner was the simple globalist message, and adding the word neighbors was second best, while the other messages just didn't perform as well, especially the regardless of faith message. So these results show the importance of the globalist identity to our donors, maybe even more so than the Catholic identity. And our next steps are to do field tests in an online environment.
So that was the testing that we've done so far around identity, and it's still ongoing. The second key concept that explains giving is the sense of impact that I feel I have. And if I feel like my donation is not going to make a difference, I'm going to stop giving. And a simple way to increase this sense of impact is by legitimizing small donations. And you can see here that just by saying every penny would help, you can increase the number of people who are going to make a gift. But again, there are many different ways you can increase someone's sense of impact. And one of them is the way you report back the difference that we've made so far. And we have a number of questions. Is it better to share the impact that the organization is having, or that the impact that the supporter is having? Should we share statistics and numbers, or should we talk about the tangible benefits that we made happen? So again, we wanted to explore all these options, and that's why, once again, we used this pre-test tool. It was part of the same project. That's why we said we tested thousands of different messages. And when it comes to impact, these are the messages we tested. The first one is about the organization's impact, and it shares numbers. So Catholic Relief Services helped 2.8 million children. And then we switched to the supporter's impact, and we have many different versions. We also use the big numbers as part of what the supporter helped us do. So you helped 2.8 million children, exactly the same message as the first, but now it's the supporter who did it. We also had a version that explained the tangible benefits that supporters offered. You helped reduce malaria by distributing bed nets, preventing inflammation and medication. And finally, we used a quote from a field officer emphasizing the impact that the supporter had. And all of these messages were compared to not having impact information at all. And again, as you can see from the scores, the first thing you notice is that any information around impact is better than no information on impact. And then we can see that the most preferred was the impact that the charity had when we share numbers, big numbers. And the second best, which is a very promising second message, is the supporters' impact around the tangible benefits that they offered. Now, it makes sense that sharing what you as a supporter did to help 2.8 million children, it might not sound feasible, and that could be the reason why it scored lower. The quote, we think that maybe a better way to express that would be an actual story of, in this case, it could be a kid saved from malaria. So that would be the next step. But from this exercise, we identified two very promising impact messages that we can now move to the field and do some more testing. But at the same time as this project, we were also doing some online testing with an email with different messages around impact, which Lauren will now walk you through.
Yep. So in our Thanksgiving email, we decided to share some information around the efficiency of our impact. In other words, we wanted to show how with a small amount of money, we had a great impact. So we added the following sentence in the test version. Last year, we were able to provide shelter, food, water, education, healthcare, and human dignity to a family of 5 for a whole year with just $10. This resulted in 41% increase in revenue and an amazing 105% increase in response rate, but it also resulted in a 58% decrease in average gift. So Kiki is going to explain why that might be.
Yeah, so this could be because of two effects. One is the outstanding increase in response rate could be because we showed the efficiency of our impact. But there is another alternative explanation. It could be that the use of the $10 was used as an anchor from which supporters make a judgment on how much to give. And maybe that is the reason why average gift dropped so much and response rate increased. So we want to keep investigating. We have an indication that sharing how efficiently we use the money is helping in increasing revenue and response rates. We just need to find a way now to keep the average gift stable. One idea is to use a higher anchor. So instead of $10, we could probably say $50 helped a family of 5, or we can change the copy. So that's the next step. And the next test, Lauren?
Yep, so another email test we did around impact was with our World Malaria Day email. In this case, we decided to test the effect of an infographic and mention the percent difference that we've made. So the infographic did increase conversion and decrease unsubscribes in active supporters, and those percentages are down there in the corner. 21% conversion and 13% decrease in unsubscribes.
So finally, the third key concept that explains giving is emotion, and we all know the importance of empathy, specifically in helping other people. And we know, again, the example of this famous photo, unfortunately, of Aylan Kurdi that was washed out on the beach, and the outpour of donations that resulted from that. And as an example, the Swedish Red Cross campaign, before this photo was released, you can see the revenue on the left. It was not even $4,000, and you can see what happened a week or even 6 weeks after the photo was released. The amount of money that was donated, it was astounding. And the reason why this happens is because we can feel empathy towards one person that is suffering way more than we can feel empathy towards the millions of people that are suffering. So this effect was tested and discovered decades back in academia. And the study that is well known is where they used 3 different appeals. The first one focused on a little girl who is hungry, and by donating you can help her. Then the second appeal focused just on the statistical information, sharing like information like millions of people are hungry. And what's crucial is the third appeal, which combined the two, the story and the statistics. And what they found was that when we have a story, people give, but the moment we add statistical information, even if it is alongside a story, the donations drop. And in one case, the use of a story, the story of a person is known as the identifiable victim effect, whereas the effect of statistics, the negative effect of statistics on giving, is known as psychic numbing. And it's called that because it's believed that big numbers numb our emotions and the empathy we feel towards people. Because what is the emotion you can feel towards the number 5 million, whereas you can definitely feel empathy towards a little girl who is hungry. So this is a well-known effect, and lots of appeals use stories of people But what we want to explore is there a more direct way to trigger empathy that is not through someone else's story, but creating a link with the supporter themselves?
So we thought our Syrian refugee update email would be a good candidate for an empathy test. Our control is on the left, our test is on the right. We adapted the email copy to add a few questions in the beginning of the email. These questions were prompting the reader to think about what it would be like to be a refugee. Where would you flee? Where would you stay? What would you take with you? What would be your biggest challenge? So this change led to a 68% increase in gift conversion and a 74% increase in revenue. And so our next steps with these results are to start testing this in some mail campaigns. And then aside, I just want to talk about our new donor onboard journey for a few minutes. So aside from previous campaign tests, we ran a longer term pilot with our new donor onboard, which covers the first 2 months after someone makes their first donation to CRS. Compared to the previous journey, our pilot group didn't receive any one-time asks. Instead, they received a couple of survey invitations asking for their identity, commitment level, and asking them for open-ended feedback. Additionally, we sent them an invitation to become a sustainer. So in looking at the results after 6 months of this pilot, we saw an expected decrease in revenue since we removed all the one-time asks, but we did see an increase in engagement with our touch points. We also received feedback from over 1,000 supporters, helping us identify and fix issues and improve the experience for future donors. For example, we gave all new donors the opportunity to opt out of their mailing address being exchanged, which can become a huge pain point later on in their relationship with us. We also doubled the number of sustainer pledges through this series year over year by replacing the one-time asks with a survey and then asking for a monthly or quarterly gift.
So this concludes the deep behavioral insights, and now, as promised, the next 3 slides share case studies around 3 different nudges. The first one is the context effects, and what that means is that the choices we make might be influenced by the other choices that are surrounding that one. And we've all been victims to this effect when we shop around and we see a cheap product and a more expensive one, then the majority of people go for the cheap option. And then when you have a super expensive option introduced, then the majority of people shifts to the middle option, the previously expensive one. And again, that's not supposed to be true for everyone. It's not 100% of people are doing this. It's just the majority of people are influenced by the context. So the question is, could something similar be happening in fundraising? And could the surrounding giving options influence the choices that supporters are making? Lauren, do you want to describe the test?
Yep. So we wanted to see if we could increase the number of regular donors or sustainer donors by adding another giving option. So in the test version, along with a monthly gift option, we offered a quarterly gift option. The response rate was the same in both versions, and revenue was also about the same, as some people opted for quarterly rather than monthly. But overall, we had a 29% higher number of sustainer donors, meaning we increased chances for further engagement with these committed regular donors in the future with upgrade asks and other communications that we have with our sustainers.
So in this case, what we discovered, and having insights from other case studies that are looking into this effect, it seems that the context effect in fundraising, it doesn't manifest itself the same way that it manifests in the commercial world. People don't really move from, the majority of people doesn't move from one option that was previously preferred to the other one, but people keep selecting the majority for what they intended, and the additional option just increases the number of people who engage. So that's a great insight, and it's way different to the way that is expressed in the commercial world. Now, the second nudge that we looked into was social proof. I don't think this needs a lot of introduction. This is about how we're influenced by what other people are doing, especially people who are similar to us. Lauren?
So we used our Footsteps in Faith, which is our monthly or quarterly giving program, email asking supporters to join the program and become monthly donors. The only thing we changed in the test version was the addition of a sentence that let people know that there are currently 30,000 Footsteps in Faith supporters and asking them to join those donors. This resulted in 17% a higher click-through rate and an increase in the average pledge and revenue. But we did not see an increase in response rate on this test.
That's also completely different to what we were expecting, because when we use social proof, in this case, sharing the number of people who become monthly donors, we expected an increase in response rates. And we did see an increase in click-through rate, which was towards the direction we were expecting, but there was no difference in response rate. On the other hand, we saw an increase in average gift, which it doesn't really make sense for social proof to do that in this case. We're not sharing how much other supporters are giving. We just shared the numbers that are joining the program. Again, one hypothesis for this is maybe just the mention of the number 30,000, again, created an anchoring effect that influenced average gift. So once again, this proves the importance of testing, because you can't really predict how these nudges who work in other contexts will manifest themselves in fundraising. Now, the last nudge that we tested was the commitment and consistency. That's all about referencing something that you've done in the past to create a sense of commitment and potentially trigger the similar behavior in the future. Lauren?
So we decided to see whether asking our lapsed supporters to give what they gave last time they gave would have an impact on their response rate and on their giving. So we added a line to this test and dropped in their last gift amount on the reply piece. And results were impressive. There was a 12% increase in response rate and a 4% increase in average gift. And that all resulted in a 17% increase in revenue for this test. So we're actually testing this again very soon. And then this might be something that we decide to roll out.
And that brings us to the end of the webinar. But just before we let you go, as a behavioral scientist, I feel obliged to issue a warning that behavioral science is very, very popular. It's very exciting. It sounds easy to do. However, it's still a science, which means we need to be careful how we apply it and how we test it. Like I mentioned, nudges or behavioral biases that have been explored in different areas and contexts need to be tested before we bring them in fundraising, because even biases that have been tested in the same context have been known to backfire. One example is, and you may be aware of this, the default bias in organ donations. So in that case, what happened was that they looked at European countries and the number of organ donors differed, and they couldn't explain why until they looked at the forms. And some countries had becoming an organ donor as a default, and you had to opt out. And other countries had becoming an organ donor as you had to opt in. So obviously that affected the organ donor rates. So several countries tested changing the default to becoming an organ donor, and that had a massive increase in organ donor rates. The Netherlands didn't test that. Because of the success of other countries, they decided to roll it out. They changed the law and they made it a default opt-out. And as this article describes, The Dutch rebelled. With a new law, the number of citizens refusing to donate broke records. So that completely backfired, and that was a bias that was tested in the same context of organ donation. So when you hear about all this today, or other biases that worked in other contexts or even the same context, remember that you still need to test it with your specific audience for your organization. And when you do that, you need an expert to guide you through it to minimize any risk. That was our webinar today. Thank you for your time. Please let us know if you have any questions.
So far, we have a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is, when you were talking about global identity for Catholic Relief Services, how did you know to focus on that type of global or globalist identity?
Yeah, that happened because when we embarked on the Insights project, I did a literature review on the potential reasons and motivations and identities that could influence helping behavior, and especially for international relief charities, which is a challenge. And a theme that kept coming up was this idea that people feel connected to other people around the world, regardless of location. And there's been a scale that was validated and research done on how to measure this concept of feeling connected with the world. And they called it globalist identity, and that's how we ended up using it.
Excellent. Then another question about the tests that have been done. Are all of the tests that are contained in here statistically significant?
Yes, all the tests that we share are statistically significant.
Okay, and I'm getting one question a couple of times. We are going to send out copies of the presentation and a recording of the seminar. So that one is taken care of. We have a couple of similar questions to each other. One is, do you have recommendation for organizations with smaller lists? And another is, how do you do this type of testing if you're an organization with a donor list of 1,000 people, for example?
That is a good question. I mean, depends on response rates. You might have a small list, but if your response rates are healthy, then you still might get good coverage. The other thing I'll say is academic studies use very small samples, but yeah, I mean, I don't have a perfect answer for this. Based on your sample size and response rate, we can make a judgment. If it's not possible to do an A/B test, you might want to test something and compare it to previous campaign results or previous year's results.
Kiki, I would just add, I don't think we mentioned this, but when we did the pretest, when we used the pretest tool, that was based on responses from about 300 and some donors. And we didn't have to email the test to as many donors as we thought we would need to get the statistically significant number that we needed. We found that the donors were very happy to just give their opinion, and they responded in higher numbers and more quickly than we expected. So just because you might be a smaller organization, I don't think you need to strike this idea from your list.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Lauren. I should have mentioned that myself. Yes, using the pretest tool could help you identify promising messages, even with a small number of supporters replying.
Okay, thank you. A question about the statistical significance at one level. Kiki, are you talking about a 0.05?
Yes.
Okay. For the empathy tests, have you tested naming the pictured child and saying, imagine you are blank person, versus saying, imagine you are a refugee generically?
No, this was the first test around empathy that we've done. So, and also we wanted the person to imagine themselves being in that situation. We didn't want them to imagine being a different person. So that's why we did it that way, but we could test that option too.
Okay. A question, can you explain the pretest? How does that work?
Yes, that is a a methodology that allows you to do thousands of A/B tests in very quickly. And how does that work? You create, you decide what are the principles that you want to test, or what are the things that you want to look into, and how many different versions you want for that. So for example, with empathy, one option is to ask them to imagine themselves being in a situation, or ask them that they are that person, or imagine their child. So we already have 3 versions. And the same can happen for other things that you want to look into. Everything can have many different versions. So the methodology, what it does is it can combine these many different versions that you want to test and create 2 different communications. And people look at a screen in an online task, and all they have to do is pick the communication that they prefer, the one on the left or the one on the right. Each communication has a different combination of these messages that you want to test. And each person makes a number of choices, between 8 and 10 choices, because we don't want this task to be cognitively demanding. But because we invite about 300 people to take part, and each person makes, say, 10 choices, that gives us the volume we need to have statistical significance when we look at the different choices, and when we infer their preference based on those choices. I realize this may be a very not clear way of describing this, but I'm happy to go through it in more detail in another call if you're interested.
Any other questions for our panelists? Feel free to keep submitting questions after. We'll reply to anything that we get after the conference as well. And oh, sorry. Do you think the results would possibly have been very different with the test where you stated the relief org's impact with stats versus the donor's impact versus the donor's impact with stats, et cetera, if there had been further specifications in place, such as simplicity of words and sentences? Because I feel like that would make a difference. So that was the question.
I'm not sure if there is simplicity of words. I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'm guessing what they're saying is if you had elaborated further on what those types of impacts were, since we tried to strip down for the purposes of the pretest to the essential message. So would a longer message or a shorter message, for example,
right,
work better?
What we're trying to test was the concept. So in this case, we wanted to see if sharing numbers was better than sharing tangible benefits. This, again, is the starting point. The testing is ongoing. So we have initial indication that when we're talking about the organization, sharing numbers is better. When we're talking about the impact of the supporter, tangible benefits is better. But now we can start exploring, maybe we can combine the 2, we can elaborate more on the numbers and also include tangible benefits. So yeah, I don't know if a more elaborate message would have a different result, probably. But what we wanted to first discover is what is the information we need to be focusing on.
Great. One person said, it's surprising to me that the organization was more effective than the U language in that same slide. Any idea why that might be?
The messages that we had, and let me go back to them if I can find them, is we had impact information shared in numbers just for the organization. And I think this was preferred because it makes sense to talk about millions of children helped when we talk about the impact that the organization is having. Now, the question is, and that's the next test that we're going to do, is would it be better if we would sharing the impact that the organization is having with the use of tangible benefits perform better or worse than if we talked about the supporter? That's still to find out, but I suspect big numbers work because it's big impact. It makes sense that an organization can have such a big impact. The supporter by themselves, it sounds unreasonable, but you can see that the U language, it worked when we were talking about tangible benefits. The difference between 68 and 64 in the preference score is pretty close. It means that that is also a strong message. So it's not about focusing on the charity or the supporter, but the question becomes, when we talk about the organization's impact, we should be using numbers, and when we talk about the supporter's impact, we should be using tangible benefits. It's a different kind of language when we focus on one or the other.
Okay, those are all of the questions I have.
Great, thank you everyone again, and feel free to contact us directly or through Nick if you have any other questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.